My name is Gabriel Melendez, Director of the Center for Regional Studies at the University of New Mexico. I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Series, a partnership between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation and dissemination of knowledge about New Mexico, the Greater Southwest as a region, and its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula. The La Canoa Legacy Series takes its inspiration from the word canoa. A canoa is a sloop-rigged fishing boat, common in the Amazon, but in New Mexico it is the name of some common everyday tools, a simple canal or flute, or the wooden paddle a baker uses to move loaves of bread in and out of a hot oven. Always La Canoa receives and transports people and resources. And we want these talks to transport us and move the conversation between presenters and audience members back and forth in rich dialogue. We also want our talks to bring practical, useful information to community members, researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, politics, sociology, and religious experiences of our region.
What I'm not going to talk, except peripherally, about the Braceros. I'm going to talk about the Hermanos Mayo, the ones who photographed the Braceros. And who are they? Well, Hermanos Mayo is a nom de guerre. It's a name that they took on. They're a photojournalist collective in Spain. They're from Spain. The name means the Brothers of May Day. And they started shortly before the Spanish Civil War broke out. And the Spanish Civil War today is forgotten, but the Spanish Civil War was of enormous importance in its time because it was the prelude to World War II. The forces of reformist democracy against fascism. And for that reason, it attracted many progressive writers and intellectuals and artists from all over the world. Ernest Hemingway from the US, George Orwell from Britain. Also, it was known as sort of the last good war. It also attracted great leftist photojournalists. Now, the problem was that the democracies in the world didn't quite see it that way. And so they didn't help the Republic. When the fascists rose up, the Germans under Hitler and the Italians under Mussolini helped the fascists, but the democracies, the United States, Great Britain, France, did not help the Republic. And that became definitive. In fact, because the Germans poured in the airplanes and all the tanks and all that stuff, and the Republic couldn't resist that. The US not only didn't help, there was a very famous Lincoln Brigade of volunteers who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, but the US pulled their passports, so they couldn't go. And this is under Franklin Roosevelt, if you can imagine. And I think had the democracies understood what was really going on, if they would have faced Hitler in Spain, World War II would probably never have occurred. But they were too afraid to do that. And so the only nations that helped the Republic were the USSR, and of course Stalin had his own agenda, and Mexico. And that, of course, because of the heritage of the Mexican Revolution, and the president at that point in time was Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the greatest Mexican president of all time. Now, the brains of the Hermanos Mayo is Paco Mayo, the guy in the helmet here, and he was an eminently modern man. He was an aviator, he was a photographer, he was, I'm almost sure, really the thinker of the Hermanos Mayo, but he was killed in 1949 in an airplane crash on Popocatépetl, one of the volcanoes outside Mexico City, so I never talked to him. And the group is made up of 5 men from 2 different families. So it's Faustino, Julio, and Candido, and their names were Sosa Fernandez, and the other 2 are Faustino and Pablo, and they're Del Castillo Cubillo, but they took the name, the Brothers of May Day, precisely to signify their allegiance to the working class and the working class movement, and also to protect their families. Well, they fought in the Spanish Civil War, some of them with cameras, some of them more with mortars, that sort of stuff. They were very brave. This is Faustino in the trenches of Madrid, and he was said to be completely crazy. He was as crazy as Robert Capa, jumping up to shoot. Also, photos of the suffering. This is the bombing of Barcelona carried out by Nazi bombers. Here's a mother and child, or a grandmother and child in the middle of that rubble. Of course, you all know Guernica, the great painting that Picasso did. And then there are some sort of more evocative photos. I have the sense that this is like a table already set, for people to sit down and eat, and suddenly the wall is gone. Now, the one photo that was taken before the war actually broke out, I think is what I find in the Hermanos Mayo. I find sort of an existentialist aesthetic, which is to say, in Sartrean terms, Jean-Paul Sartre defined the limits of freedom in today's world as what you can do with what they are doing to you. And that's what the Mayo did. And in this particular case, these were prisoners. 30,000 political prisoners had been picked up. The Republic was really trying to not look leftist. The Republic was not necessarily leftist at all. And so they were rounding up socialists and leftists and stuff like that. And they had put them in the prison. And so they coordinated with these guys that Paco would fly over and he would photograph them at the moment that they formed a red star of resistance. And so you can see once there, that whole existential aesthetic, what you can do with what's being done to you. And, one of the great photos, one of the great war photos of all time, Robert Capa was there, Gerda Taro was there, Schim was there, Walter Reuter was there. All the great leftist photographers went to participate in this war. And so it's a really effervescent period, and to a great extent the birth of modern photojournalism in the world, with the small cameras that you can get right in the midst of things. With the defeat of the Republic, the Mayo come to Mexico in 1939. 3 of them are able to get out immediately. Julio was captured, couldn't get out until 47. Pablo came over in 52, but 3 of them, Paco, Candido, and Faustino, were able to get out in 1939 to Mexico because very few countries would accept the refugees from the Spanish Civil War. Mexico received the vast majority of them. And they worked as photojournalists in Mexico. And their archive is composed of 5 million negatives. 5 million negatives. How long would it take to see 5 million negatives? Well, once I was doing a project for the University of California, and the negatives come in envelopes. And actually, these are envelopes in 14 different categories. But for instance, there's an envelope that would be called, say, chronological. Let's say envelope number 16,939 is the 5th of July, 1958, the striking railroad workers, that sort of a thing. But the minute that you've taken out a strip from that envelope, there's no way of knowing what envelope it belongs to, and so the director of the AGN allowed me 2 weeks to pull, the negatives out of envelopes, and I found that the most number that I could look at were 2,000 negatives a day. And I would walk out of the National Archive, with my eyes burning, the Mexico City fog, burning like the Mexico City fog. Now, if you could see 2,000 negatives a day, and if you could work 365 days a year, it would take you 7 years just to see the Hermanos Mayo negatives. And of course, that's not the problem. Because if you're going to analyze photojournalism, you have to compare the photos that are taken with the photos that are published, and how they're cropped, and what the cut lines are put on them, and all that stuff. And the Mayo worked for 40 publications. So what happened really, I'd been working on them. They interested me a lot personally, but I didn't know what to do with it. You know, and suddenly in the early 90s, my friend, his friend today, this guy came to see me, Jaime Velas, and he said, I'd like to do an interview with you. And I said, what about? You know, and he said, about the Mayo. And I said, but I've already done very long interviews with him, and that's in the National Archive. And he said, I know, I've seen that, but I want to interview you too about them. Well, you know, I said, what are you doing? And he told me, he said, well, I'm doing a book about migration up in the north. And I said, well, let's do a book about the Braceros photographed by the Mayo, migrants photographing immigrants. And he said, well, that's, you know, that's a great idea. So that's where the book was born. From there, eventually it came out in Spanish. In the 90s, it was in English. It eventually came out in Spanish. And then in 2015, the director of the Railroad Museum asked me to do the exhibit, part of which you see here, the Braceros photographed by the Mayo, but it was a huge exhibit, a really enormous exhibit. And once Trump got into power, I said, this is an exhibit that doesn't have to be seen in the United States. It has to be seen, this is an exhibit not for Mexico, but for the United States, as a way of countering the racism of Trump and the Republicans, you know, to show a time in which Mexicans were not only welcome, they were recruited to come to the U.S. So it was very funny how the project changed. And the Braceros were absolutely fundamental to the war effort, both in doing agricultural labor and in doing repairing the railroads. And so they made sure that the food, you know, continued to flow to the front, and they were praised by the U.S. press as a reserve army. Now they covered everything, as you can imagine. If you've got 5 million negatives, you've covered everything that happened. But they owned their own cameras, and they bought their own film, so they never turned in a negative to any of the publications. They would only turn in positives. And the best thing they did was they made a catalog of this enormous holding, because otherwise you just have piles, you know, it would be like a morgue, as newspaper archives are called. So that was very, very important. Now, one of the interesting things about the Hermanos Mayo is we can use them to talk about differences, the different forms of photojournalism, because we all know what photojournalism is. No, it's really easy, no? Until we begin to think about it, you know. And at one pole, we have somebody like Sebastião Salgado, the Brazilian, you know, who can dedicate 6 years to a project, you know, workers, for instance, you know, or migrants, but he's publishing at the same time in the New York Times, that sort of stuff. And at the other end, we have a guy who works for a daily newspaper. They've given him one roll of film with 25 exposures, and they've given him 5 work orders, and they say 5 photos in each order, not one more, not one less. You know, and he turns in that roll, never sees it again, has nothing to say about the photos that are chosen, etc. So how can we compare these? You know, one level of photojournalism would be, of course, somebody who works for a daily newspaper. And so basically you're not going to have anything to say about what you're photographing. You've been assigned to go cover this strike, you know, and take some pictures of this strike. And you're not going to have anything to say about how these photos are used, basically. And that's, most people, when they think about photojournalism, that's what they think about, you know, daily newspaper, but it's not. And it really also changes, for instance, if you do magazine, if you're working, today it's very different, but really between the mid-1930s and the mid-1950s, magazines were enormously important in the world. Picture magazines, Life, Look, Collier's, Post, etc. No, the Vous in France, Picture Post in England, all over the world. In Mexico, there were many, and the big ones were Hoy, Mañana, and Siempre. Today, Tomorrow, and Always. Those were, 3 different magazines. And if you work for a magazine, basically you're given a week or so to cover a story, and you're going to take a lot more photos, and you're going to be constructing a narrative in your head while you're doing that, because you're going to have to construct a visual narrative, And then finally, what you reach is what I would call documentalist. Documentary is a very poor word because it covers an enormous amount of all photographs are documentary. There's no photograph that is not documentary. That is the essence of photography, that it's somehow you have a sensitive film that records the light that is reflected of the object in front of you. So that even if it's Edward Weston's picture of a bell pepper, that's still a documentary about that bell pepper. What happened is that everything got defined sort of backward. That basically when people think about photography, they think about art. If you want to study photography, you're probably going to have to study that in a history of art program. But what percent of photographs are art? Let's be really generous. Let's say 3%, So why do we think about art when we think about photography? Because that's sort of the edge of the margin of the margin of the margin. The real serious stuff is economy and history, and then here's culture, and then there beyond culture is art, and all beyond art there's photography. Well, that's not really how it works. Photography is the center of our lives. We see 1 million photographs a day, above all today. But photography has been the center of our lives from the mid-30s, really on. And even though those magazines disappeared by the mid-50s, they were replaced by television. But basically, that definition comes because of interests that are created. Interest by the interest of museums, the interest of galleries, the interest of collectors, the interest of people that are investors. That's why when we think about photography, we think about art, because of all those material interests and the interest of art history departments. That's why it's very difficult to study photography beyond art history, and that means then you're going to study art history. Actually, the story goes back even further, because the first exhibit that was ever done of a history of photography was done in the MoMA in New York by, what's his name? I'll remember in a minute. Anyway, he did it was in 1939, and he did this whole big exhibit, and they were all artists. And then they made slides of those. So if you wanted to teach photography anywhere in the world, that's what you taught it with these 250 slides of art. And so what we would call vernacular photography, which would be 98% of photographs, scientific photography, family photography, photojournalism, et cetera, has just been ignored, basically. We don't study photography, although that's what dominates our lives. And so that's why I say documentary as a word was sort of invented to say, well, this isn't art. This is, something else. Whereas really all photographs are documentary, even art photographs. And so what I call the photographers that would have the most autonomy in terms of what they took pictures of would be documentalists. And the Mayo fit there because the Mayo, since they kept their own negatives, and of course today with digital, it's completely different. Before we're talking about chemical photography. You turn in the roll, that's it. But of course today everybody's using their own cameras, or even if they're using cameras given them by the medium, they keep the negatives. They can keep their own negatives. And so, say if Mayo is going to cover the breakfast of a president, he sees a wonderful shot. If we had the computer, we could see this shot, of a little girl selling gum outside the metro station, and he just takes it because it's a good photo. And that photo then ends up in an archive called Imágenes de la Ciudad, Images of the City, which has 500,000 negatives. in it, and they're all just mixed together like that. Just, well, I shot here, I shot there. How are we doing? Oh, okay.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. In all these negatives, are there dates or?
It depends.
With them?
It depends. For instance, in the case of the Braceros, what happened was, since the Bracero photos seemed to be in demand, because the Mayo also lived from reselling, what they did at some point was they took them out of the chronological envelopes and they put them in a concentrated envelope called Braceros. And so we lost all the dates, And so we can tell by the film and we can tell by the clothes, but yeah, we lost the dates in that particular case.
The originals were done chronologically.
Yeah. Every time they shot, they would do it chronologically, and then they would come, and then, like I say, when the demand was great, then all of a sudden they went into concentrated. Let's hope to God. This would be, for instance, a daily photograph. This was made, he goes, he covers the strike, he, prints up the photos, he takes 5 or 10 photos in. He probably shoots 70 photos, since it's their material and they're buying huge reels of 35 millimeter film, cutting it and filling it themselves. This would be like a magazine photography on, the introduction of mass media. This is like around 1958. You can see the brand new TV screen there, the record player below. You can see the chairs in lines, and probably they were buying the TV on time and selling seats to the kids, the neighborhood kids, 25 cents to come and watch TV, and that's how you pay off the TV. And then this is the photo that, like I say, would be a documentalist photo in the sense of this little girl. He was just getting on the metro, but I love it because look how he uses that angle. He's using a high angle shot to trap that little girl in the concrete jungle that Mexico City is, and it becomes then a metaphor for her life, because she's not ever going to get out of being trapped in a life of poverty and selling gum because she can't go to school. She has to sell gum to help support her family, So it's a wonderful metaphor there constructed by the Mayo, who've not really received the recognition they should in Mexico. There's never been a major exhibit of the Hermanos Mayo, for instance. But in part, that's because they're foreigners. I think that's also, that's the other element. And this is a wonderful photo. This would be like for socialis, for the social news. It's a wedding, you can see in the background there. They probably paid the newspaper to send photographers to take the picture of the wedding, but Mayo there decides to take a picture instead of the old lady who's sweeping up the rice to eat it, and so you've got a couple things here. One thing is this is a meta photo. This is a photo about photographing. You see the guy on the right-hand side, he's a photographer. You can see he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. Whereas the Mayo is taking, a photo that is irrelevant to what they were sent to cover and also irreverent. It's taking a picture of a poor lady instead of the rich people who paid to have the photo taken. Now, when we study photojournalism, one of the ways we do it is we talk about how the photos are used. Now, this is, to me, the most powerful photo that I know by the Hermanos Mayo. It's a mother crying about her son who has been killed, and he was a young leftist who, in Mexico, we lived the perfect dictatorship. It was a party dictatorship from around 2000, really until right now, up until 2018. I mean, the PAN came, it was the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. That's sort of a contradiction in terms. But, you know, they were in power until 2000, and then the right-wing party came in. But it was the same party. We just called it now the PRIAN. They were the PAN, so we called it the PRIAN. Until 2018, finally a leftist, they allowed this guy to win because they had committed fraud against him again and again and again. But this time he got more than 50% of the votes, which in Mexico is just unheard. Well, of course, with the perfect dictatorship, the guy's got 99% of the votes, you know, but that's gone, let's hope. At any rate, but this photo was from 1952, and it was the May Day March, which is also interesting that, you know, it would be the May Day March. And what would happen is that the independent and the leftist workers would try to infiltrate the sort of organized official workers, you know, because they all had banners that said, "Thank you, Mr. President, for our wonderful salaries," you know. And these guys would be in the march to protest, and the undercover cops would kill them. And so that's what happened in this thing. It was the last year. The guy here to our right, on the right-hand side, was the president of Mexico. Here he is, arm in arm with the guy who was the head of all the Mexican unions for 70 years. You know, totally corrupt. Yeah, total hand in glove there between the workers and the government. But he wanted to be reelected, and so he wanted that march to be, you know, very, very officialist. And that's why the fellow was killed. The image so impressed David Alfaro Siqueiros, the great muralist, that he put it into a mural. But it couldn't be published in the coverage of the magazine Mañana because it spoke too much for itself. So they could publish this one of a little girl who's been overcome by tear gas, and as you can see in the red provocation of the 1st of May, you know, an innocent victim. And this photo could be published. And the reason that this photo could be published was that they identified this guy who's been beaten up as a pistol-packing communist. You know, and the workers had defended themselves from these pistol-packing communists, and they beat him up. Well, that's not what it was. The guy was an undercover policeman who was killing the independent workers. And even the official workers got so angry with him that they beat him up, and they took him over in front of the president, and they said, "Here is the killer, cabron." You know, fortunately, he was going out of office, the president. Wouldn't want to call him that. But this photo simply couldn't be published until 1952. And this is very interesting in how they changed meanings of photographs. Because what a photograph means depends entirely on its context. Photographs float. They have to be anchored to within a specific discursive context to have any meaning whatsoever, you know. And in this case, they couldn't publish it. It was too near to the killings, and so they couldn't publish it in 50, but they did publish it in 52, but they published it in a photo essay of the best 13 photos by the Hermanos Mayo, and they took it completely out of its real context, and they said they transformed it into what is called nota roja in Mexico, the bloody news. And that's really big in Mexico. You know, all these horrible, horrible pictures above all now with the drug wars and that kind of stuff. And the title they put with the photo was, "Who is she? Who is he?" Their simple names from the pueblo are condensed in this brief eloquence: mother and son. The mother destroyed by pain, the son felled by death. The scene, the Red Cross, someday in 1950, any day in which drama can occur. In other words, you take a historical photograph that's about a very specific movement, you know, against sold-out leaders, and you turn it into just bloody news, just another example of bloody news. But I wanted to do that for two reasons, because one of the there's two things here that I think are important. One is to indicate that photographs are always ambiguous and always polysemic. And so it always depends on their context. And the other is it tells you the situation within which photojournalists work, which is to say they have no power over, you know, how their images are used. And Julio, who was very Spanish, you know, and as we say about the Spanish, al pan, pan, al vino, vino, you know, they gonna straight talk, you know. And one day I said, Julio, how do you feel about the best photo you ever made, or the best photo that I've ever seen you made, that was totally, the meaning was distorted? And he just went, you know, nothing to say. But the Mayo did try to elude that position. They founded magazines, critical magazines, as you can see here, a magazine called Más, More, and it's a, you know, a very critical analysis of the poor, how the poor live in Mexico. But they also very consciously assumed the attitude of workers. So that, for instance, this is one of their more famous photographs. It almost certainly was taken by Paco, and it's the heroic worker, you know, with the sledgehammer over his shoulder. I mean, the only thing that's missing here is the scythe, you know, to turn it into the communist symbol. He's framed heroically, a low-angle shot, giving him lots of power, framed against the proletarian sky. You know, and when I showed it once to talking with Julio, he said, oh, that's Stakhanovist. And Stakhanov was a coal miner in Russia who mined 100 tons of coal in less than 6 hours. And so that became a movement worthy of emulation, you know. And Julio, who was not terribly I mean, he was not leftist as Candido or Paco was, he said, oh, yeah, that's really, you know, Stakhanovist. But, you know, it's really decontextualized. I like this photo a whole lot more. For instance, you know, how workers are formed by the situation in which they find themselves. You know, that interplay between, you know, the factory and the worker itself makes me think of Charlie Chaplin and Modern Times, you know? Or this, which I like even more. This is an assembly line, a Ford company assembly line in Hermosillo in the north. And of course, an assembly line is to turn workers into machines. You know, the stuff goes by and you put your thing in, you know, and the minute they can replace you with a machine, they replace you, you know. But in the midst of that, this face stands out and looks back at you. You know, he's doing something that's being done to him. You know, and so, you know, that's it strikes me that that's really much more than at the level of a metaphor. You know, he captured it. He didn't pose it. You know, he wasn't looking to have that happen, but it did. And you can see here the way in which they use planes to give meaning. This is the 1958 strike of the telegraphers. In 1958-59, everybody struck. A huge general strike, and among them were telegraphers. And I love it because in the foreground, you've got 3 planes here. In the foreground, you've got the army occupying the offices of the telegraph workers. In the second, you know, in the middle ground, you've got the telegraph worker looking at the guy with a good deal of disdain. And then in the background, you've got the image of the president, you know, who's keeping all this in order by sending in the army. And I love the way in which he has framed, you know, the image of the president between the helmet and the bayonet. You know, and I have, you know, I've tried to, when I have tried to sort of push the Mayo for exhibits in Mexico City, I had one guy who was sort of the czar of photography in Mexico City, and he was in charge of like this really a lovely series of photograph books. And I took him like 40 Mayo photographs, and he just went, "Where's the aesthetic search? Where is, you know?" I was just, no, there's nothing there. And I said, "You don't know how to look." Or here. Now this is brilliant. This is 1968. It's the student movement of 1968. If you remember, I'm from the Universidad Autónoma, the autonomous University of Puebla. And what that means is that the police and army cannot come onto the campus. You know, obviously it's sort of like, at the same time, it's sort of like, all, you know, when you see lots of laws about don't whip your slaves to death, it doesn't mean that they're not whipping the slaves to death. It means they probably are whipping the slaves to death, you know. And I think autonomous is the same sort of thing, but by and large, they're not allowed to come in. In this case, in the 1968 movement, they went in, and now, but look at the brilliant, what Mayo did by bouncing his flash off of that bayonet. Without that bounce, you don't have the photo, you know. I mean, it's really a brilliant aesthetic strategy, and then there are the guys lying on the ground, but they're still venceremos, we will win, you know. And so once again, it's people doing things with what is being done to them. And Tlatelolco, which was the biggest massacre in Mexico's modern history, where they sort of closed in a group of people that were protesting. And what was the most cowardly, they wouldn't let them out, and they just fired on them for an hour. You know, I mean, hundreds died. But this photograph is a history of Mexico, because in the sort of foreground to the right, these are the pyramids. Those are pyramids where the Aztecs made their very last stand against the Spanish. To the left is the colonial church, and of course, that's how the conquest was carried out. Basically, you know, and that was always the excuse. We're civilizing. The Spanish say this to this day. We didn't conquer the Indians, we civilized them, you know. And in the background, you have the modern apartment buildings that were built by the dictatorship, the perfect dictatorship, for the workers, and on top of it, the bullet holes. You know, so it really becomes like a history of Mexico, you know, in one photograph. And here's the future of Mexico. And again, it's Tlatelolco. And I love it because this is what Umberto Eco would call an empty text, an open text. Because there's no bodies, there's no blood. You don't need that. You don't need to see that. We all know what happened on the 2nd of October. This is the 3rd of October. Instead, we get a history lesson. And here's a message about the future of Mexico, because the woman is pregnant, and they're looking at the bullet holes, you know, in the windows. And of course, the 1968 movement fundamentally transformed Mexico, because it was very clear that the Mexican government would kill middle-class people, not just campesinos and workers. So that was very important. So now, aside from their commitment to democracy and to the working class, they also introduced the 35mm cameras. Now, 35mm cameras were invented in 1924 in Germany, but they weren't really widely used until the Spanish Civil War. And when the Myau arrived in Mexico, they immediately, you know, they didn't have their cameras, but they immediately got 35mm cameras. And in the beginning, the Mexico newspaper said, you can't make good photographs with a 35mm, a tiny negative like this, you know. You had to work with a Graflex, you know, so you got a big negative like this. And in part, that was a rejection of foreigners, you know, they didn't particularly like that. But once you've got that camera, you've got a whole new aesthetic. You know, this transforms the aesthetic of photojournalism. One, you're getting movement in the frame. Constant movement in the frame. That's the modern aesthetic of photojournalism. See those legs moving. Now, see on the very far right of the photo, you see the guy with the little camera? That's Pablo Mayo. So the Mayo were covering, more than one of them was often covering the same thing. These are from the 1958 strikes as well, a Red Cross crew rescuing people. But as you can see, that you can get right into the middle of all the action with that little camera. If you had to walk around, you know, with a big camera on a tripod and everything, you know, you're not going to get this kind of an aesthetic. And so the Mayo essentially played the same role in Mexico that European immigrants played in the US media, like Alfred Eisenstadt, the guy who took the picture of the kiss, was a German, and Robert Capa was Hungarian, you know. So basically the Mayo played the same role, and as Julio said, bringing Leicas into Mexico was like bringing in Volkswagens. You know, nobody had ever seen that before. And so you get really dynamic pictures like this of the communications workers demanding the firing of the director. But like I say, it was also a reaction to them as immigrants, because Mexico is not a country of immigrants. Mexico is not a country that has ever received a lot of immigrants. And racism in Mexico is very, very complex. I mean, on the one hand, certainly Indians are treated in a racist way. Blacks, they're just beginning to realize that blacks are in Mexico. And then whites are treated, if in a very privileged way, it can also be difficult. I remember my daughter coming back home crying one day, and she's really a very strong person, you know, and she got in a fight in the street. And of course, she's blonde, because my wife is Spanish. And so Mexican, well, we're both Mexicans, but we're not Indian. We don't have Indian blood. Well, I have Cherokee, of course, but that's a joke. My grandmother always said that. You know, and she comes back and she's crying, and she said, well, she got into this hassle in the traffic, you know, and this woman screamed at her, "What? Go back to your country." And she goes, "What is my country? I was born in Mexico." And I said, "Annalie, you have 3 passports. Mexico, the US, and Spain. You get to choose. Whatever country you want to belong to, you get to choose, you know." But anyway, it's very complex. But they introduced the 35 millimeter cameras, and that, of course, then allowed the use of telephoto lenses, which they brought in, and filters and stuff like that really changed Mexican photojournalism. And so you get angles. They're always looking for angles. Here they're empowering the railroad workers by shooting them with a low angle, very dynamic attitude. Here they're empowering women that are reconstructing airplanes in the 40s. Again, very dynamic, low angle shot. Here they're using a high angle shot to show bureaucrats at their desks trapped. You know, a high angle shot traps people. Planes. Here you can see a worker on the Latin American tower. I mean, very interesting, no safety gear at all. You know, he's way, way, way up there, but you get a wonderful play, you know, between your foreground and your background there. So they're always using planes. Or here, where you have the women protesting during the 1968 student movement, and at the very back of that, in the middle, is the monument to the revolution. So this is sort of saying, well, Mexico needs another revolution. We have one now with the 4th transformation. And meta photos. You know, they go and they take photos of little kids, and the little kid puts together a camera and takes a photo of Myau. And they've covered, you know, everything, you know, anything, and everybody. This was a big prize-winning photograph by Paco Mayo of a grandmother learning to read by candlelight. Here are people. Water's always a problem in Mexico City. This is what I would call a directed photograph. You know, he told them to stand there. I don't think he found them. There's nothing wrong with that. The Capa photo is also a directed photograph to some extent. Water, here the woman, she had to go down into the street to get it, but she's got some water. She can go back up in her apartment now. This is the first day that women could vote in Mexico, 1953, and a couple of campesinas voting. This photo I love of the washerwoman. And it was so funny because when I did my first exhibit of the Mayo, I put this on the, you know, this was like a signature photo, and I put it on the cover of the little booklet. And Julio said, "I don't know why you put that photo. That's not even one of ours." And I thought, Julio, there are 5 million negatives. How do you know, you know? Or here, you've got almost a Louis Hine kind of a photo, a child vendor, you know, who can barely reach the window, you know, to sell the chicles, to sell the gum. And of course, he's emphasizing how small the child is by having him do that. Transport problems, you know, we talk about Mexico City being crowded. This is 1946. People hanging onto the streetcar. Flooding used to be an enormous problem in Mexico, not so much anymore, but here you can see great flooding. This is the funeral of Pedro Infante. Pedro Infante was like the great Mexican screen idol, and they still celebrate his death every year. Or here, this is the Ixtapalapa, they recreate the crucifixion. 3 million people go to see this. You know, but I love the way they photographed this. This is one of the best ones because you've got that foreground Roman soldier, you know, and then you've got the cross right in the middle, and then you can see behind the enormous crowds, you know. So you've got all kinds of information, and at the same time it's very expressive. And you can see here their capacity to capture the exact precise moment. This is Joselillo, the moment that he received his fatal goring. You know, just that fraction of a second. And it's incredible because the Mayo, since they come in strips, sometimes they will repeat a take. Almost always the first take is better. You know, just because they have that hand-eye coordination. They have the eye and they have that hand-eye coordination, you know. Now, and the Braceros, of course, which is what you all came to see, was the exhibit. This is actually, I cropped this photo, one of the very few photos I've ever cropped, because I really like, it gives a great dynamic effect. And this was I think what they were doing here, there's about 25 of these photos, and I think of these negatives, and I think that what they were doing was like setting up the sort of thing that they'd done with the sledgehammer and the worker, no, except this was going to be about braceros. You know, and they included the women. Here you have the women selling food. There was only men migrated, families didn't migrate, but of course women were present. You know, selling food to the braceros, who would be standing in endless lines, you know, and here's a woman selling water to them. And then, of course, the women that were left behind, here's the saying goodbye. And, you know, I mean, at one level, you know, I think that, how would I say, I mean, it was an adventure for many of them. I mean, they're young men, why not? Go off, you make some money, have an adventure. You know, here lifting the child to say goodbye. They also documented the transformation. The first ones were urban workers, and you can see that. All these guys are overalls. You know, now these guys would go on probably to work on the rail lines. But then, after a couple of years, they said, no, we only want agricultural workers. Because you can't take an urban worker and send them out to work agriculture. I mean, working agriculture is really difficult. It's really hard work. And you can see the transformation here now. You know, in a couple of years now, it's basically all your agricultural, your campesinos that are coming in, and they're going to go there. And the interesting thing, too, is you can see here the interaction between Mayo and the guys who, you know, who are going to go as braceros, because they were both immigrants. To the Mexican photographers, these guys were vendepatrias. They were selling out their country to go to the north, you know. There was always, up until very recently in Mexico, you know, the idea was if you went to the north, you were not a good Mexican. And so the Mexican photographers did not take good photos of the braceros. They didn't get what the Mayo did. They also had different responses. These guys are really proud, you know, to pose for the photograph, and these guys are hiding their faces. You know, so you had different, you know, very different responses to being photographed. Now, one of the things that one can find in the Mayo photographs are things that people don't see. I often lecture, I must have lectured 50 times around using photographs as social documents around Mexico. And I put this photo up and I say, okay, you're a historian in 2050. What do you see in this photograph that speaks volumes about Mexican culture? And people go, oh, the pant legs are sort of wide at the bottom. The guys have long hair. Well, there's a feminist symbol. This is like the background. There's going to be a feminist march in 1971. And they'll go, oh, there's feminist symbol. What they don't see is Boston. They don't see it. Because all over Mexico, people wear T-shirts and sweatshirts that say property of the Dallas Cowboys. You know, and when I first moved to Mexico, You know, I remember I was working in television. I was way up in the altos of Jalisco, and I see all these people with property of the Dallas Cowboys. And I said to my colleagues, you know, that I was working with, I said, "Wow, look at this! What? What are you talking about? You know, the guys with Dallas Cowboys. Oh yeah, sure, yeah. Well, that's neo-colonialism. That's cultural neo-colonialism. You know." The Americanization of Mexico. And so Santa Claus, for instance. Santa Claus was never celebrated. You know, American football, junk food, tourists. You know, and they covered all the protests against U.S. imperialism. This, for instance, is a protest against the 1954 overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala. You know, where the CIA came in and overthrew him because he looked a little bit too left for them, even though he was democratically elected. The U.S. will accept any democratically elected president as long as he follows their orders. If he doesn't follow their orders, then they'll overthrow him, and that's exactly what they did. And here, for instance, from that same protest, we had to play to Frito-mania, and there's Frida Kahlo 11 days before she died. Out there protesting against the U.S. involvement in Guatemala. And Candido Mayo was a photographer for Arbenz. The whole time Arbenz was in office, he was working with him. So they had I think the Mayo had a very critical view of the U.S. I never talked, you know, extensively with them about that. But as I said, to begin with, the idea that the U.S. would not only not help, but would hinder any aid to the Republic, whereas Mussolini and Hitler were helping the fascists. After the overthrow, the U.S. would not allow refugees. Very, very few refugees from the Republican side were allowed to come in the U.S. You know, they were just seen as too dangerous. Those people are too dangerous. You know, and basically, that's how U.S. immigration works. They let in right-wing refugees, the Cubans who fled Fidel, the Vietnamese who collaborated in U.S. imperialism there, they'll let those in, but, for instance, they wouldn't let the Spanish refugees in. When the dirty wars occurred with the Argentines, the Brazilians, the Uruguayans, nope, they can't come in either, you know, and so Mexico received a lot of these. And when Mexico received this enormous influx of the Spanish refugees, this just transformed Mexican culture. And many of their children are, you know, very, very high-level professors and artists, and, you know, it really was incredible. And, you know, they had hoped, all the Spanish refugees said, well, when Franco falls, you know, but the U.S. recognized Franco very quickly in the early 50s. You know, and even though the guy was a fascist, you know, well, we'll recognize him. Whereas Mexico would not recognize Spain. They broke off all diplomatic relations with Spain until Franco died in 1975. You can see the attitudes. I was looking through the envelopes one day, and there was a bunch of photos of U.S. air bases in Spain, and they had written on the envelope, they'd written, "Yankee invasion of Spain to defend imperialist democracy and protect the Spanish from liberty. If the Spanish people were not defended by Yankee democracy, they would be free. Yankees, go home." And when Faustino Mayo gave me his book, he wrote, "For one of the good North Americans." And then the other guy, Pablo, said he wouldn't allow me to interview him because he said, I don't know, I don't talk to fascists. But he was a bit weird. But Julio was a trip. We went to his 100th birthday party, and he stood up and he had a full glass of wine, and he said to leftists, the only people in the world that can still think. And he drained the entire glass, you know, and his daughters are behind him like this, you know. But he was 100 years old. But as I say, they photographed just about everything. Here was the Bay of Pigs, of course, organized by the U.S. And here it says, Cuba will not be another Guatemala. Here's Lázaro Cárdenas, the great president who allowed the refugees to come in, and here he is speaking in favor, you know, again in favor of Cuba. Here is the protest against the U.S. invasion of Santo Domingo in 1965. And here's, this is the U.S. Embassy, because the U.S. Embassy was attacked so much during the Vietnam War, you know, that they had to turn it into a fortress, and then they had to put lots of Mexican police to guard it. Here's the protest when the U.S. overthrew the Salvador Allende in Chile in 1971, and he's kicking the American flag, burning the American flag. And some of the protests have a little lighter tone. There was a rumor, and it was just a rumor, that where Elvis Presley was alleged to have said, "I'd rather kiss 3 black girls than 1 Mexican." And, you know, of course, that was terrible, you know, and so this was a protest against that, and they had grabbed this poor dog, clearly befuddled, you know, and they draped around his neck, hound dog, you know, as an anti-Elvis protest. But I think throughout their years of collective labor, the Hermanos Mayo have been true to the name that they gave themselves. The Brothers of May Day. Thank you.
One question.
Yeah.
Who was printing their photos?
They were.
Individually, each one. So they all had their...
No. They all worked as a collective. So that, you know, they would come back. I think Julio did more administrative stuff. They also had helpers, you know, people that wanted to learn photography would come in and work with them. We're probably work in their dark room and do a lot of the printing for them, you know. So yeah, and in some cases in the magazines you will see credit given to individual Mayos, but usually it's just Hermanos Mayo, you know, or Photo Mayo, you know. But yeah, they worked completely as a collective. So no, it wouldn't be that one guy would come in and necessarily print. He might, you know, say that just a guy, okay, look, you know, print up these and let me look at it. Let me see what, you know, or, you know, he might mark them. When I first started working in the archive, they hadn't sold it to the National Archive yet. And so I was working right in their archive, in their little office. And I would find negative strips with clips pushed through them and paper, and, you know, I mean, it was like a, you know, terrible. And I remember saying to them that I was also working in the National Archive doing research, and I said, you guys got to buy this. And it worked out. It was incredible. They sold it for a lot of money, for what was a lot of money in 1982, and in 1982 the peso crashed. And so they ended up with very little money in terms of what they had sold the collection for. But everybody wanted that collection. The University of Texas wanted that collection. Everybody was after that collection. And the Mayo said, no, Mexico saved our lives. This collection stays in Mexico. And so, you know, I think that they, you know, in that sense, they were certainly very patriotic. I imagine they became citizens. I don't really know. Yeah, I think they became, and of course they had children born and grandchildren born and, you know, stuff like that. And they integrated, you know, completely. But yeah, they always had, Julio would talk about his wife going to the market, and she'd come home crying, and she'd say, oh, they make fun of my accent, you know, because she was Spanish. You know, being an immigrant anywhere is not easy.
Any other question? You must. These images are great. Yeah.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing such an extraordinary history with us, and illuminating so many pieces of history that I was previously unaware of. I really appreciate that. I'm curious, 5 million photographs is an extraordinary feat. I'm curious what you think the Hermanos Mayo's lasting cultural, social legacies are in photojournalism and documentalism.
Well, like I say, I think that, one, they've not received their due in Mexico. You know, there's been a lot of exhibits of many minor, even photojournalists compared to them. But also it's just so hard to work with with that mass. I mean, you really need a collective of some 20 people dedicating 20 years to really begin to understand what is in there, and then how it was used, you know, how it circulated, you know. So it's difficult because they haven't really been reevaluated, and yet their photos are used constantly. People are always checking them out of and to me it's very sad, because what happened was there's two big photo repositories in Mexico. One is the Fototeca Nacional, which has maybe 4 million photographs or something like that. That's where Tina Modotti is, Nacho Lopez, Casasola, all the photos of the revolution, you know. But they take very good care there of images, and almost everything is digitalized. They have never digitalized the negatives of the Mayo. And different directors would come in, and I'd go in and I'd say, come on, let's go to Kodak and let's cook up some sort of a program, you know, to get all this stuff digitalized. There's even what do you call it? Nitrate-based negatives, which are inflammable, are in their collection. You know, and it is in a room that has air controlled and all that. But one of the directors of the National Archive, the directors of the National Archive is always a political appointment. It is not because this person is a historian and really knows what's going on. It's a plum, it's a hueso, it's a bone that's given to, you know, to somebody. And there was one woman, and this is a woman who flies pretty high. She's now going to be the ambassador, the Mexican ambassador to Colombia. Well, she refused to turn on the air to cool the negatives because it used so much electricity, you know, that it cost so much, you know. So they could have burned up that entire negative, like they burned up the entire Cineteca was burned up, because instead of providing really vaults to store that, the government decided to give $250 or $25 million to make a very, very bad movie made by a Soviet director about John Reed, you know, and you know, a horrible movie. And I can remember coming back from the airport and watching the film history of Mexico burn up. You know, so it's a problem, you know, and like I say, every time I go, I don't go much now. If I need something, I, you know, send an assistant and stuff, because getting anywhere in Mexico City is hard. But every time I've gone, I get disappointed. When we were putting together this exhibit, there are photos that are not there because they're gone. They were taken out of that envelope, and somebody could have just stolen the strip itself, or they could have just put it somewhere else, you know. But it takes people that really, really know and sometimes when I'd go in, they'd go, oh, John, we have a pile of strips. Can you help us with these? You know, and I go, okay, this is July 4th, 1958. This is a railroad strike at Nonoalco, you know, and oh, okay, you know, and they could find that, and there, you know, and other stuff. I just said, no, I don't have any idea. So, you know, I think that, you know, history is written by historians. You know, and it's going to take people to really study the Mayo, and you know, it's not going to be me. You know, I've done what I could do, which was, you know, write the book about them and I've done a number of exhibits of them, and then of course this exhibit, which I think is very, very important for these times. But yeah, it's hard to say really what their eventual. I mean, now already there are people saying, oh, well, they didn't really take all those photos. You know, other people were working for them. And, well, they're all dead now. So, you know, we can't find that out. And who knows what they would have said anyway. I imagine, you know, I don't know what Julio would have said. If I'd have said, Julio, I understand that, you know, at least 1 million of the photos were not made by the Mayo, you know, and he would have said no. But so it's hard to tell, because it's hard to tell who is ever going to study them, and yet their photos are used constantly. What's interesting is like the 68 photos, those have been used so much that all those negatives are scratched, whereas the 58 59 photos are absolutely pristine. And so I was going to do an exhibit on the 58, 59 because the negatives are so beautiful. And then they changed the director of the Centro de la Imagen, and that was just an idea that never came to fruit. But, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, they're always going to be a presence in Mexican history. But what their legacy as photojournalists will be is difficult to say.
Who is the president of Mexico now, and what is his party affiliation?
The president of Mexico is AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and the party is Morena, and he's a leftist. He is very, very explicitly anti-neoliberal. And what he always says is, primero los pobres, the poor first. We have to take care of the poor. And that's why we have the crime we have in Mexico. Well, I mean, all the drugs come to the U.S. The drugs are not for Mexicans. The drugs are for here. You know, and all the guns come from here. You know, so it's really sort of unfair when Mexico gets blamed, you know. But at any rate, I think that he certainly, it's the first time that I have ever lived in a country in which I had faith in the president. I've never thought that I would ever live in a situation where I would feel at home. And I am Mexican. I became Mexican about 10 years ago. And I'm very proud to be Mexican, and I would be very ashamed today if I had to say I was an American, beginning with the name itself, because of course we're all Americans. Anybody in North and South America, we're all Americans, you know, and so actually the US is the only country that doesn't have a name. The people don't have a name, you know. I mean, Michael Moore said, well, maybe, how about the big ones, you know? You know, that was one answer. But yeah, and you know, I mean, he's going to have his failings. When he first started, it was really incredible because 50% of all the gas in Mexico was being stolen. You know, and by what's called huachicoleo, which was they'd open up the pipes, you know, and they'd steal it, and then they'd leave these pipes open. And the villagers would come out, they, oh, free gas, and then one exploded, and I think 170 people were killed, you know, that sort of stuff. He stopped that. 50% of the revenue in Mexico, and that's the biggest revenue, was being stolen. And that is now down to something like 8%. You know, so he's going to change it. I mean, to begin with, Mexico is not a poor country. Mexico has enormous wealth. But one problem is its big northern neighbor, you know, and I think the only reason, so that for instance, when he stopped the huachicoleo, the mob, you know, the mafia, moved against him, and they caused these enormous gas lines. You know, well, now you know nobody likes to wait for an hour to get gas, you know, and that's going to produce social unrest. And the incredible thing was 75% of Mexicans said, that's fine, as long as he stops corruption. You know, and they put up with it, and within a week he'd solved it, you know, and that was it, you know, and I think that's what he's going to do. You know, he said nobody can earn more than him. Nobody who works for the government can earn more than he does, and he cut the president's salary in half. And he took away the multi-million-dollar retirement from the ex-presidents who stole so much anyway they didn't need retirement. See, they had castles in Spain, you know. So he's already, you know, working, I think, in a very, very positive way. And I think there's hope, you know, because the last one was so corrupt. It was like from the minute he got into office, it was like telling the governors, steal everything you want, and they did, you know, and he stole everything. There was the official presidential house, which is 14 times the size of the White House, and he stole every stick of furniture, every piece of silverware, even the red telephone. He took everything out of it. He stole it, just stole it. You know, I mean, that's the sort of presidents we had, you know, and when this guy came in, first he said, I'm not going to live there because that's in the middle of Chapultepec Park, and I want to be with the people. And he's in the National Palace. He's in the center, in the Zocalo, and he turned that into a museum, you know, and they had to buy some furniture from Deco or, you know, the Finnish, I forget, the Swedish, you know, and to get some furniture in there. But yeah, I am very, very optimistic, and it's certainly the first time that I've ever lived in a place that I could believe in the people that we're leading. Yeah.
Are the drug cartels that powerful in Mexico? Because I heard in some regions the drug cartels own the police and own whatever.
Well, it all depends on where. Of course they're very powerful, you know, because they make a lot of money selling their drugs up here. Like I say, they don't sell them in Mexico. I've never seen Coke, you know, for instance. I've been living there since '81, you know. And of course they're powerful, but there's the underlying social problem, which is the poverty, you know, because you have the richest man in the world. Carlos Slim is a Mexican. You know, I mean, he's now not the richest, but he was, 5 years ago. So you have enormously wealthy people in Mexico and enormously poor people. And if the poor people don't have work, what are they going to do? They're either going to have to come up to the U.S., you know, or they're going to have to become criminals. And what he's saying is, hey, no, we're going to start social programs that are going to give people work, and that's what you have to do. You know, you have to pay people decent salaries. There's no internal market in Mexico because the salaries are so low, you know. And then they go, so that all the industrialization and all that stuff was done for export. The railroad lines were built to ship stuff to the U.S., not to connect Mexico. You know, and Carlos Slim, for instance, played his role. He had a monopoly on the telephone. And so the telephone system was one of the most expensive in the world. And so what are you doing when you do that? You're cutting communication between Mexico City and Guadalajara, for instance, you know, and that's what he did. He was a vampire. You know, now he's had, with the new telephones coming in, he's had to change his tune. And he is a relatively, relatively informed billionaire, you know, in the sense that the guy really puts a lot of money in culture and, you know, and you watch, it's very interesting to watch AMLO, you know, because he doesn't want to alienate the business community either. You know, I mean, it's not a revolution, you know, and he's very clear about that. You know, he's saying, look, this is the fourth transformation, and we're going to transform the economy, but we're not going to scare people either, you know. And so when he gave his 100-day talk, he talked specifically. He said, and thanks to the entrepreneurs and the business community, you know, and as they walked out, because of course all the TV stations are against him. You know, all they do is, you know, just constantly criticize him. And so as Slim is walking out of the meeting, one of the guys comes up to him from the TV station and says, well, what about the crisis in Mexico? And Slim looks at him, he says, what crisis? You know, we're gonna get by, we're gonna do all right, you know. So yeah, it's a big change, and yeah, you know, but if it weren't for the U.S., the drug cartels wouldn't exist. Because there's no market in Mexico for that. People don't, you know, it's up here where they want the drugs. You know, I suppose to the degree that they legalize marijuana and stuff up here, that's going to help. And if they make guns illegal, that would really help. But as it is, you know, they can come up here and get AK-47s and whatever they want. So.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming.